Thank you for finding us again. No stoplights. Want to begin by thanking our sponsors, as we always do: Francis Marion University, Carolina Bank, Micky Victor's, Marlboro MPD Electric Co-op, McCall Farms, Pepsi, Florence PLC Commercial Real Estate, and our Florence County Legislative Delegation, all supportive of what we're trying to do here. As we, I've been teasing this for a good while, but we've not had the opportunity to disclose our future endeavor because we're trying to dot I's and cross T's, and it's a bit complicated because we're not in complete control of the negotiations. If you can imagine, a negotiation normally consists of one party negotiating with another. We are well aware of where our position is, not quite so sure the timeliness. We're sure of the nature. I mean, it's good-natured, but it's just the time-sensitive part of when we can make the announcement, what exactly the announcement will be. But I'm excited and encouraged, and none of this would have been possible without, once again, our very great list of sponsors. This will not be a long podcast. I want to be, I kept reminding myself riding over today to not talk a million miles an hour. I have a tendency to talk a million miles an hour. I have a tendency to combine words. I think the greatest word we've ever come up with is hope-tomism. Why be hopeful and optimistic when you can be hope-tomistic? That's just my mouth running a million miles an hour and my mind not having the capacity to do what my mouth tries to blurt out on some of these occasions. We talked last week in our podcast, No Stoplights, and I want to remind you, and I mean this sincerely, the radio show is conservative talk. There's no denying that. I don't shy away from it. I'm a Republican. I host a radio show that kind of spins things very much to the Republicans' advantage. I don't think I mislead. I don't think I'm dishonest, but I do spin, and I do try to navigate the complexities of American politics, blaming the Democrats for about all the problems while giving the Republicans credit for all the successes, the few successes that government has had in recent memory. This is different, and I mean this sincerely, because the sponsors, when they agree to be a sponsor of this podcast, I made it very clear that this is not going to be an extension of the radio show. This is not conservative podcasting 101. We've done some of that. We've done a lot of interviews in days gone by. In recent time, the presidential election has kind of dominated what we've discussed on the air, and we did one last week about the presidential election. I think we did the 2 week before Election Day update, where we are, where does it look like we're headed. We're a week past the last podcast, and it looks to me like, in the aggregate, that, and I think we did a podcast a while back, maybe a couple of months back, that I told you, our viewers and subscribers, that I felt this race would break significantly in favor of one candidate or the other. I always felt it would be Trump, but I was never quite confident enough to say it's a slam dunk, it's a layup, it's over with, nothing to see here. I still don't feel that way, but I do believe that the prediction I made several months back is beginning to come to fruition, in that the polling data, and I'm talking about reputable polling, the polling data seems to be trending very much in Trump's way. Over the last 3 weeks, Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, has gained about an average of 1 percentage point per week. And that's monumental. That's a big advantage. When you're 3 weeks out, 3 points down, and you're 2 weeks out, 2 points down, 1 week out, 1 point down. In fact, the RCP aggregate today has Trump up in the national popular vote polling by 0.1%. Has him up in the swing states by about 0.9%, a little more in some states, a little less in others. But I think we're to the point now we can establish that the campaign for the last 3 weeks has kind of broken in favor of Donald Trump at the expense of Kamala Harris. I don't want to get in the weeds and try to argue why I think it's happened the way it has. There are multiple theories, some credible, some not so credible. But I do think we can say 1 week away from Election Day, the trend lines are beginning to favor Donald Trump. The betting markets are beginning to kind of reflect what the trend lines and the polling data is beginning to show. Now once again, that does not mean Trump is inevitably the winner. It means I think he goes into Election Day the favorite, not overwhelming, but the odds-on favorite to be elected the next president of the United States. If Trump is indeed elected, and he has these big policy initiatives, these big ambitious plans, and he says he's learned some hard lessons from 16. I don't think he understood how complicated Washington can be. I don't think he paid much attention to who controlled the Senate, who controlled the House. I think this time he's learned some things. I'm not saying he'll be a better president. I'm not saying he'll be a worse president. I think he'll pay attention to some things that he didn't pay a lot of attention to in 2016 when he was the consummate political novice, and he'll have to have advantages in the Senate and House, and that's what I want to dedicate this podcast to, particularly the Senate. We'll do a little bit of work in the House, but I got the whiteboard. Karl Rove and I don't agree on America First, but I do believe that we agree on the effectiveness of the whiteboard. His is a little more fancy. I think he's got, something to get wipe clean. I don't. I got a Sharpie and some cardboard here, poster paper. But I want you to stick with me for a second as we walk through what I see as the Senate today. Today in the United States Senate, the Republicans have the Democrats have a 51-49 advantage. So if that stays status quo, Trump is not going to get many policy initiatives passed. I don't know what his ambitions are. I don't know what his priorities are. He talks a lot about tariffs. He talks a lot about mass deportation. He talks a lot about government efficiency. Now, once again, talk is cheap. A lot of politicians say a lot of things on the campaign trail, but when it comes time to govern, it gets a lot more complicated. So you've got the White House with its objectives and priorities. You've got right now the Congress in the hands of the Democrats. So why should Trump be ambitious about introducing some policies to begin with? I would argue that there's a pretty good chance he goes into office with control of the Senate. We'll get to the House in just a second. I think there's a much better chance than 50-50 that Donald Trump, if elected president, will have a working majority in the United States Senate. Today, it's 51-49. I want to kind of illustrate the most likely flips. West Virginia is now represented by Joe Manchin. There is no way that West Virginia votes for a Democrat. West Virginia is going to send Governor Jim Justice to Washington to be its junior senator. That is beyond a shadow of a doubt. As far as I'm concerned, Joe Manchin is not running for re-election. He saw the writing on the wall. So you flip West Virginia, you go from 51-49 to 50-50. John Tester is in the fight of his life in Montana. I think Montana's the third Trumpiest state in America. I think it's Wyoming, West Virginia, and then Montana. Tester's done a hell of a job figuring out a way to stay elected a Democrat in one of the reddest states in America. That's coming to an end. He's running against a guy named Sheehy. She's up about 4 or 5, maybe 6 in some of the more favorable Republican polling. Montana's going to flip. So we go from 51-49, Democrats having an advantage, to 51-49, Republicans have an advantage. That is almost a sure thing. West Virginia is sure. Montana is an almost sure thing. Those two flips, once again, go from 51-49D, 51-49R. The concern that a lot of Republicans have is when you have a 51-49 majority of the Senate, you've not accounted for Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Susan Collins of Maine, who are what a lot of you would consider rhinos. They're not dependable supporters of the Trump doctrine nor agenda. They will vote the company line at times. They'll vote in lockstep with Republicans. But on some of the big issues, mass deportation, if we try to replace some of the taxing of the private sector with tariffs, they may balk at that. So that puts Trump or the Trump doctrine in a very precarious situation on day one. And here are the other seats that I think we really need to pay close attention to a week out from the election. In Ohio, Sherrod Brown, a Democrat, has a 1-point lead over Moreno, the Republican. In Pennsylvania, John Casey has a 1.4-point lead over McCormick, his Republican rival. In Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin has a 1-point advantage over the Republican Hovde. And in Michigan, I think Debbie Stabenow was the incumbent, decided not to run for re-election. You got a Democrat Slotkin, a Republican Rogers. The Democrat has the advantage there by 2.9 percentage points. So here's what is in play. In Ohio, Brown's trying to stay a senator. In Pennsylvania, Casey the same. In Wisconsin, Baldwin the same. And in Michigan, Slotkin, the Democrat, trying to replace Stabenow, the Democrat. If the Republicans, if the Democrats run the table in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, Murkowski and Collins become incredibly important in how ambitious some of this Trump transforming government is going to be. But if Trump has a big day, if some of the early voting, I don't want to get into early voting and absentee voting, there's some trend lines that seem to favor the Republican. I don't know that we're in a place in America to have a wave election, but it looks to me like Trump is going to win the election for president, and there may be some coattails in some of these swing states. But the odd part of these, in all four of these states, the Democrats play in defense. The Republican is trying to take a seat away from a Democrat. I've got them listed as I think most likely to least likely. I think it's a toss-up with Moreno and Brown in Ohio. I think it's a toss-up in Pennsylvania with Casey and McCormick. A lot of that will be determined by some of the early voting, some of the absentee voting. Ohio's not a swing state in the presidential election, so there won't be the all-hands-on-deck effort in Ohio that I expect Casey to benefit from in Pennsylvania. Wisconsin, another swing state. Tammy Baldwin, the incumbent, up 1 percentage point. Democrats playing defense there. And in Michigan, I think it's least likely. In other words, if Trump has coattails, Brown's in trouble. If Trump has a little longer coattail, Casey's in trouble. It's going to take some pretty long coattails for Baldwin to be in trouble in Wisconsin and Slotkin to be in trouble in Michigan. Anything's conceivable. The Democrats could win all four of these seats. And the Republicans have, because of West Virginia and Montana, a 2-seat advantage, but depend on Murkowski and Collins, and that would temper some of the plans of the Trump administration. So, once again, the Republicans are going to have the advantage in the Senate by at least 51-49. It could be 52-48, could be 53-47. Anything north of that, I think we're being overly ambitious. I know you got Kerry Lake and Gallego in Arizona for the seat that is up for grabs. I'm trying to think of her name. She's an independent. Decided not to run for re-election. My mind escaped. Should have wrote it down, didn't. That's why I'm a minor league podcaster, not a major leaguer. But Kerry Lake is trailing significantly, not just her opponent, but Trump in general. Trump will probably more likely than not win the presidential the presidential vote in Arizona. Lake looks to not be performing anywhere near as well as Trump is. And then in Nevada, some would argue on Trump's best day, Nevada's in play. It's got to be a damn good day for a Republican to win the Senate seat in Nevada. I didn't list Nevada or Arizona, just like I didn't list Texas or a couple of other lean red states. I think these are, this is the crux of the matter. Democrats today lead 51-49. Republicans are going to flip 2 seats. They will have at least a 51-49 advantage, but how dependable is Murkowski from Alaska? How dependable is Collins from Maine? That's why you probably, if you're Republican, and you got the filibuster, and I get all that, but if you're Republican and you want to kind of push the ball down the field on some of these America First agenda priorities, you kind of got to pick off 1 or 2 of these. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan appear to be the most likely suspects. You go to the House. You need 218 margin for majority. The Republicans right now have a 220-212 advantage. I think there are 3 or 4 vacancies, 3 vacancies, if I'm not mistaken. The RCP, Real Clear Politics, they do a lot of aggregating. They don't do a lot of polling, but they do a lot of compiling the aggregates of the polling. And right now, RCP says there are 42 toss-ups. There probably are 42 toss-ups if the Republican candidate has long coattails, if the Democrat candidate has long coattails, I tend to look at the House as if they're somewhere between 25 and 30. I would probably argue that 30 seats are in play if the Democrat or Republican presidential candidate have a real good night November 5. 42, I understand they lean. It's likely. You got a slim margin. You redistrict. There's some reapportionment. I just 42 to me seems like a lot. Some of the trends I've looked at, some of the data I've tried to understand convince me that 42 is probably an overstating of how many true swing districts there are. There seem to be about 30 as far as I'm concerned. Here's the oddity of the 30. About a third of those are in New York and California. We know those states are voting blue. I don't care how many times Trump goes to Madison Square Garden. I don't give a damn how many times he goes to California. He's not going to get any electoral college votes out of either of those two states. But it doesn't hurt if you feel like you're in a good place in the electoral college race for president, and you know how important it is now to have the majorities in the House and Senate. It certainly doesn't hurt to try and go lend a hand to a House race in California that is in a swing district, a House race in New York that is in a swing district. I would argue, I think it looks like to me that the Republicans will maintain advantages in the House. I hesitate to say, because the House is so, the Senate reflects the state. The state assigns an electoral college or a slate of electors, and there's some consistency there. Trump running well in Ohio is good for Moreno. Trump not running well in Wisconsin is good for Tammy Baldwin. So there's some overlap in the Venn diagram of Senate races and the presidential race via the Electoral College. The House is just, it's its own animal, and it's hard to really understand. To be honest with you, the only people that probably truly understand this are the extreme junkies and the campaigns themselves. Where is, a swing district in California a week out from the election? The national media doesn't know. I certainly don't know. The campaigns know, and I would imagine there are some extreme junkies out there in the world. We did a podcast with Robert Cahaley a while back, a couple of weeks back from Trafalgar. I would imagine that Robert's been hired by some campaigns to do polling in some of these real off the beaten path House districts in California and New York, and some others. If they're third in California and New York, that means there are 2/3 that are not in California and New York. So in wrap up, it looks to me like a week out. We're exactly 1 week away from Election Day. I think today there's been somewhere in the vicinity of 50 million votes cast. I don't have any idea what the final tally will be. I think the last number, in 2020, it was about 155 million votes. So we've cast about 1/3 of all the votes that'll be cast and counted. There's a couple of days in some of these swing states. I think I read today that about 18 states end early voting on Wednesday or Thursday of this week. There will be a narrative and a counter-narrative. Pennsylvania is something I pay a lot of attention to. The Democrats are outperforming the Republicans in early voting in Pennsylvania, but by a lesser margin. How much are the Republicans cannibalizing their Election Day vote by convincing Americans that election semester is now the better way to win elections? I could speculate. Michigan looks a little bit encouraging for Trump. Arizona looks a little bit encouraging for Trump. Georgia looks a little bit encouraging for Trump. And I'm not trying to look through a red lens. I'm not trying to be a Republican hack or homer here. But it is what it is. And I think going back 3 weeks ago, the trends began favoring, kind of breaking in Trump's advantage. And if you look at the Real Clear Politics number and you look at some of the reputable polling, it's about 1 percentage point per week. Well, that's good for the Republican in Ohio, Republican in Pennsylvania, Republican in Wisconsin, Republican in Michigan. I don't think it matters in West Virginia, Montana. I really don't think there's anything the Democrats can do to not concede that race to a Republican in West Virginia. And Tester, God bless him. He's done a hell of a job in figuring out how a Democrat survives in a state like Montana. But once again, we can go as far down the rabbit hole of data gathering and data dissection and trying to understand what all the numbers mean. I think in conclusion, here's what I'll say, and we may be wrong. I mean, this might be the last podcast we do before the election. I argue it's about a 2 in 3 chance that Trump wins the Electoral College. It's about a 1 in 3 chance that Trump wins the popular vote. I think that's on the table now. I mean, I think when you look at where the race was in 16, where the race was in 20, and where it is today, Trump's overperforming. The polling suggests that the popular vote is now in play. I think that's ambitious. That's why I've got it somewhere in the neighborhood of, 33%, 1 in 3, might be a little less than that. But I think the likelihood of him winning the Electoral College is well north of 50. I may be a little bit ambitious in trying to say it's 6%, but it's easy to say 2 out of 3 for the Electoral College, 1 out of 3 for the popular vote. I think there's an 80% chance, maybe even a little higher, 90% chance that the Republicans flip the Senate. But 2 of the Republicans, once again, have been Murkowski and Collins, who have proven to be not so dependable. If you're an America Firster, they have that prerogative. They have that right. They've earned the right to go represent the people of Alaska and Maine as they see fit. And their vote counts just as much as the most rabid Trump-supporting America First senator, and that's the way it should be. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, I'm going to level with you. I don't know. I don't have a clue. I mean, I don't. There are moments in the day that I think the Republicans could win all 4 of these competitive races. There are moments in the day that I think the Republicans are going to lose all 4 of these competitive races. And then we flip to the House. Once again, the House right now, 220, 212, 3 vacancies, advantage Republicans. RCP says 42. I say somewhere south of 30 competitive districts. A third of those are in California and New York. And as much as I'd like to be an extreme junkie and tell you that I've broken down, all of these districts, I've broken down absolutely none of these districts in the House. I'm going by what some other experts say. I've done a good bit of work with the Senate, done a lot of work with the presidential race. But I think, who wins the House, I think will be a reflection on what presidential campaign had the best run. If Harris has a good last closing week and it gets tighter and it looks like she may have a chance to win the Electoral College, then obviously the House will be very much in play, and the Senate will be no worse than 50. There's nothing Harris can do in the last week to turn West Virginia and Montana back into favoring a Democrat Senate candidate. There's just nothing they can do there. There's obviously a lot she can do in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But once again, the House gets so complicated because you redistrict all the time, and you got it leans a little heavier R, a little bit heavier D. It's just real hard it's real hard for me as someone who really doesn't have a lot of skin in the game when it comes to who represents the 5th District of New York, who represents the 11th District of California. You got to be an extreme junkie, and I guess I don't qualify as an extreme junkie, and I don't have a family member, or a close friend running in some of those races. Once again, this will probably be the last podcast we do before the election. Hold me accountable. I mean, if I don't know what I'm talking about, it'll be obvious I don't know what I'm talking about. But I'll look for Trump to win the Electoral College. There's a slight chance he wins the popular vote. If he wins the popular vote, then Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan are very much in play. If he loses the popular vote by a couple of 3 percentage points, it's an absolute toss-up. I mean, there is no denying that. And I think the popular vote will have a lot to do with who wins control of the House. Thank you for joining us. We'd ask you to subscribe, to follow us, to do everything you can do to help us make this podcast soon to be announced. Kind of an additional element to the podcast, but we appreciate all you've done. And I do want to make sure I do this because our sponsors come from a variety of places on the political spectrum. And I don't want you to believe that because I say these things, it's endorsed by our sponsors. It's certainly not endorsed by our sponsors. Our sponsors endorse communication and conversation and arguments in some way, shape, or form, the back and forth that is required to get America to a much better place. So I want to once again thank our Florence County Legislative Delegation, PLC Commercial Real Estate, Pepsi of Florence, McCall Farms, Marlboro MPD Electric Co-op, Victors, Micky Finn's, Carolina Bank, Francis Marion University. Without these fine and very charitable sponsors, none of this nonsense would be possible.